What's up, YouTube? So, everybody's talking about coding agents, the end of the software industry, vibe coding, and so on. I don't think they're as useful as the hype. So, as a disclaimer, there's a lot of ethical concerns around the existence of LLMs, many of which I agree with. I think they use too much power. I think there's all kinds of other problems, like recent OpenAI news. For this video, I'm glossing over those because I want to just talk about how useful they actually are. Because I think the ethical concerns are more for the question of should LLMs exist, which, no good answer to that. Whereas in this video, I just want to talk about the question: should I, as a software developer, use LLMs for coding? Before I give you the answers to that question, I should be fair. LLMs are not useless for small self-contained tasks, things like concept rewording for translation between programming languages, sometimes even human languages, one-off scripts that will help a workflow that is particularly nasty or whatever, feedback on codes or on docs and code snippets and other stuff that you've written, stuff like that. They're handy, convenient, and they're pretty fast. And the consequences of failure for those things are pretty small, right? But the reason that it's fine is because the consequences are very small. Like the blast radius is not huge. If they mess up a code translation, it's pretty easy to verify if one piece of code is the same thing as another piece of code. You just run them. If the script isn't perfect, then you can probably fix what it gave you pretty fast, assuming that it's a small self-contained enough script. And feedback on stuff can just be ignored if it's bad feedback. Who cares? The problems get into when you start asking it for things that have bigger consequences. When you start asking it to write entire documents, when you start asking it to do entire applications or refactors or features on legacy products, things start to get complicated. For one thing, LLMs are still very good at making shit up that just sounds right. And conversely, they'll also just ignore things, even if you tell them not to. It's kind of a roll of the dice. If they're going to reinvent a library, if they're going to ignore a function that already exists, they might just make up APIs. They could, pretend that things are not as they actually are. They could misuse APIs. All kinds of other stuff can happen. And of course, this can still happen with smaller scripts. But again, blast radius. It's a lot harder to fix. Fix this happening in like a 10-file refactor or feature implementation than it is with a 500-line script. And on that note, simply by their nature as statistical models, LLMs are non-deterministic. Some people say that you can just use prompt engineering or context engineering, and that will ultimately fix all of the problems, and LLMs will become deterministic enough for you to write, any kind of software that you want. These people need to get checked for gambling addictions, because that's all you're doing is you're just sitting there hitting the slot machine, over and over and over. And sometimes you're like, oh, if I time it this way, then it will finally give me the triple sevens. That's not how they work. There are things that they just will not do, unfortunately. And then another point, the LLM doesn't learn. You can give it context, you can give it MCP tools, whatever. But the problems with that are that context is a limited resource, and the LLM performance will degrade as you add more and more context. The other thing is that context will also affect the cost of every single call. And so for usage-based cost models, if you're using the APIs, stuff like Claude Code and Gemini Code Assistant, whatever, those are just you get a certain amount of usage packed into a subscription. But for API usage, and I think probably enterprise models as well, I don't know for sure. But for anything where it's usage based, teaching the LLM gets slightly more expensive every time, and so that's not great. And on that note, not only does the LLM not learn, your learning also suffers. And certainly you can learn something by reviewing LLM generated code. By virtue of training on a whole bunch of code, at least some of which must have been high quality, either by chance or by design, LLMs can produce pieces of high quality code. They can also produce awful code, which is, it has its own purposes for learning. But ultimately, if you're completely abdicating every single line of code to an LLM, you're not practicing the motions, You're stepping away from the tools that that we use to build software. You're stepping away from the small decisions and all of the little struggles that teach and remind us all of these, small incremental things over time. Like what's like, how should I name this thing? Is this function name descriptive enough? Like, have I, like, does this interface make sense? All of these kinds of things you're just stepping away from. And, is that good? Is that bad? Seems kind of bad to me. And the advocates may respond to this point by saying that, soon enough, the LLMs will be so good at coding, we won't need to have this expertise. But if that's true, then how will we eventually get to the point where we are, senior and above engineers who have the mental models that we use to design the systems at large? And, for that matter, would we even need it if the models are so good? Could they not just do the design at that point? Could they not just iterate on 1,000 implementations at once to brute force a design? Doesn't that mean the death of the industry? And if the industry dies and no one has a job anymore, then why do we need to prepare for this world by getting better at these tools? Like, we won't need them anymore, right? And then, if they never get good enough, isn't it better to just not lose this expertise? Seems clear to me. So, the last thing I want to say today in this video is actually kind of positive for using LLMs in a kind of roundabout way. The way that I think about LLM code is basically it's instant legacy code. As soon as it generates the code, the person who wrote it won the lottery, and they just left their laptop, walked out the door, and you never see them again. And the problem with this is that it might look fine at a glance. They probably put, some effort into it. But it also probably has, like some number of problems. It may not have like security considerations. It may have performance issues. Like all kinds of different things could be wrong with it. And you don't have anyone that you can ask about why it did all of these things, or at least not reliably, right? But if it's small and self-contained enough, then it's a nice opportunity to examine a piece of code, break it apart, run it inside of your application, figure out if the abstractions are reasonable or not, come up with edge cases, and also learn how or how not to do something. So it has value kind of in it can help you learn in that kind of way, but it's still instant legacy code. So do you like? You don't want to put your name on just that, right? You want to make sure that it's been, reviewed and vetted, and that like you feel good about putting your name on it. At least I hope you do, because if not, then whatever, just ship it. Who cares? So, to answer the video title, are LLMs useful for coding? The answer, as anyone who's been in this field for a while knows so well, is it depends. So thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Give the video a like, hit the subscribe button, and more than anything else, I hope you have a great day. Thanks. Have a good one.